With this video, we're going to take a quick look at ethnicity and race. I'll lay out some of the basic definitions, but I also encourage you to go through the videos that I've linked in the video description for some more detailed examinations of ethnicity and race, as well as racial and ethnic discrimination. So let's start by asking the question, what is the difference between race and ethnicity? Well, as we've discussed before, race is meant to reflect biological or physical differences significant enough to separate humans into discrete groups. But we also know that the concept of race has been invented by humans, and that there aren't actually those physical differences that are so significant that you can draw clear lines around groups of people. You know, you can't use skin tone to separate people, you can't use eye color or hair texture or facial features. There aren't any physical characteristics that sort people into groups like that. We're all a lot more variable than a phenotypic definition of race would really allow for. So race is a socially constructed folk taxonomy, meaning it's how humans have attempted to parse difference and find patterns in the world, but it doesn't really match up to what we know to be biologically true about humans, which is we're all humans, right? Now, ethnicity, on the other hand, means identification with and feeling part of an ethnic group, and exclusion, therefore, from other groups because of this affiliation. And an ethnic group is people who share certain beliefs, values, habits, customs, and norms because of their common background. But the boundaries between race and ethnicity can be fuzzy, particularly as they're used in society. Members of a shared ethnicity might have different racial identities, and people of shared racial identities might be members of different ethnic groups. So it's hard to just say ethnicity is this and race is that, because they commingle a lot. And if we take, for example, the individuals pictured here, how many races are represented? How many ethnicities are represented? Would it surprise you to know that all of these people are in fact Brazilian? So we have people sharing a Brazilian identity, and yet clearly from a variety of ancestral backgrounds. So how do those two things fit together? Well, in fact, individuals often have more than one ethnic identity. Take a look at this map. Here we see some very big ethnic categories, and I got this map by Googling ethnic groups map. So it's perhaps not the most refined, but we can still pull something out of this, okay? So in Africa, for example, we have this whole swath of West and Sub-Saharan Africa classified here as black or capoid Congoid in sort of the hot pink or fuchsia in the center. But of course, we also know that within that pink chunk of Africa, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of ethnic groups, people who define themselves as a group and therefore not members of other nearby groups. And here's a map of some defined ethnic groups within Africa. It's a lot more complex than this big pink blob might suggest. Some identities, therefore, are not mutually exclusive but contextual, which means that a person can hold multiple identities. A person can be African and be Fulani, or they can be African and Tumbuka, or African and Luo. Being African doesn't take away from being Fulani or Tumbuka or Luo, and being Fulani or Tumbuka or Luo doesn't take away from being African. However, depending on the circumstances, it might be more important to stress one identity over the other, and this is called the situational negotiation of social identity. So there might be certain circumstances where having this sort of like Pan-African identity might help a large group of people corral power in some sort of way to achieve a certain goal. But in other instances, those smaller scale ethnic groups are going to be more important for asserting more individual aims or community-oriented goals. Now, in many societies, racial or ethnic identities are associated with a particular position within a larger social political hierarchy. A majority group in that hierarchy often has larger numbers, but not necessarily. The distinguishing feature of a majority group is being the group that has more wealth and more political power. Similarly, a minority group often has fewer members, but it's really defined by having less wealth or political power within the larger hierarchy. In the United States, a person's racial and ethnic identity is typically ascribed at birth, meaning a person takes on the ethnic or racial identity of one or both of their parents. However, because racial categories are socially constructed, meaning they're created by humans, the rules for assigning racial or ethnic identity are pretty arbitrary. For example, in the United States, the rule of hypodescent was in place for many years. This is also called the one-drop rule. That meant that a person with only a small degree of African ancestry would be defined as black, regardless of the rest of their ancestry. To be black, according to the one-drop rule, a person would only need 1/32nd ancestry. That's a single great-great-great-grandparent. They would only need one great-great-great-grandparent to be considered legally black, no matter what their physical characteristics. But to be considered Native American legally, that requires 1/4 or 1/8 ancestry. So it's not even the same in terms of ascribing ancestry between two different groups. And when it comes to Native Americans, it's also largely influenced by acceptance of the tribe in question rather than just blood. So we're looking at different rules for assigning racial identity or ethnic identity within a single system. The rules of descent also change over time. And they change as society changes. So Irish immigrants to the United States and their descendants today would be considered white by most Americans, but they weren't considered white until the mid-1800s. And Jewish Americans were not considered white until the 1900s, and specifically after World War II. Another interesting example of the intersection of ethnicity and race is the case of a group of people called the Californios. The Californios lived in the Spanish colony of what is today California since the 1600s, but their populations included Spanish people from Spain, but also Native Americans and also people of African descent. So it was a group of mixed ancestry in this single sort of colonial system. But what makes this group really interesting is the ways that people were racially defined among their internal social hierarchy. It had less to do with a person's particular ancestry and more to do with their wealth or social standing. So a person could actually begin life as one race, but then as they gained wealth or married or changed mannerisms or behaviors or appearances throughout their lifetime, their racial identity within the group could also shift. So we typically don't think of race as something that can change throughout a person's lifetime. But in this example, we see that race is not just about ancestry, it's linked to other social factors. And then, of course, we have the example of the Tutsi and the Hutu. And if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, you know that in 1994, over 800,000 Tutsi and Batwa were killed by Hutus during the Rwandan genocide. The distinction of these two major ethnic groups, the Tutsi and the Hutu, may go back hundreds of years, but it was absolutely exaggerated and delineated only in the 1800s by German colonists who preferred the Tutsi over the Hutu. And then they used the relative wealth disparities between these two groups and physical characteristics like eye color and nose length to really create a legal system to codify these people into separate ethnic groups. And then, of course, we have the U.S. Census, which started, the first census in 1790 started out with 3 races, but over the last 200 some years has added and subtracted and changed definitions of race multiple times since then. With any discussion of race and ethnicity, of course, we need to talk about prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice means devaluing a group of people because of their assumed behavior, capabilities, or attributes. Basically, it's using stereotypes to have negative views about people. And then there's discrimination, which includes the policies and practices that harm a group and its members. So prejudice is the judgment, and then discrimination is the action based on prejudice. Discrimination can exist in 2 ways. There's de facto discrimination, which is practice but not legally sanctioned. And de jure discrimination is legally sanctioned, meaning it's written into law. School segregation in the United States was a form of de jure discrimination until 1954. South African apartheid was also a form of de jure discrimination, which legalized segregation and discrimination of all kinds until 1991. So when discrimination is legal, meaning that there are actually laws that say that one race or one ethnicity can do this, and another race and another ethnicity cannot, that is de jure discrimination. Discrimination based on race or ethnicity is technically illegal in the United States today, but we know, of course, that de facto discrimination still exists. Segregation is illegal in the United States, and yet we know that there is incredible segregation in the U.S. So let's take a look at some maps that highlight some examples of segregation here. And also just, these are beautifully made maps. I mean, maybe the patterns they're showing us aren't beautiful, but they're really kind of lovely to look at. And they do give us a lot of information in a very straightforward and simple way. So here we see the United States. One dot represents one person. We have our key in the upper right-hand corner here. We can see at this scale how some census groups are clustered across various portions of the United States. And you know, when we think of segregation, for many people, our thoughts turn to the South, right? And when we talk about like desegregating schools in the 1950s and the 1960s, most of the stories and most of the political action around that was coming out of the South. But in fact, if we look at schools, for example, the place with the highest educational segregation today is New York. New York has one of the highest rates of segregation when it comes to education within the United States. We know that people tend to go to school in their communities. So if the city is segregated, whether or not that's legal segregation, when we see that the city is segregated, then so are the schools. And we can see those delineations here on the map. Here we have the island of Manhattan in the middle, and then of course we have the Bronx, we've got Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and then we have Jersey over here. So, you know, we can see how various groups of people have been are clustering in various parts of the city, and then that's also represented within the schools. We see similar patterns if we look at Chicago. There are some pretty clear delineations. Also, Los Angeles, right? So here we have the Pacific Ocean out in this white space, and then this is all the beachfront property, right? And then finally, in probably the most striking example of this, we have Detroit. And this line right down the middle, that's that 8 Mile road. And it's literally a line between, you know, two groups of people, two ethnic groups of people. So we see that these patterns of segregation have continued, you know, until today, until this is 2010 data. And that absolutely affects then you know, lots of other elements of social life. So finally we come to this concept of nationalism. A nationality is an ethnic group that once had or wishes to have or wants to regain political control over basically themselves and their own territory. Nationalism, therefore, is developing and maintaining a national identity based on shared characteristics such as culture, language, race, religion, political goals, or belief in common ancestry. Nationalism isn't inherently good or bad, but it's often taken to an extreme and sort of requires prejudice and discrimination against those who aren't part of the nationalist identity. So we're going to sort of leave things here, and you can turn to those other videos, but the final question that I want to leave you with is, do we see nationalist groups in the society that we share today? Of course the answer is yes. So to sort of expand on that, you know, what are these nationalist identities based on? Is it really shared ancestry? How close does that ancestry be? Or do a lot of nationalist groups today have less to do with the shared characteristics of the group? And is it more about excluding groups against whom a person has prejudices? All right, so check out those links in the description for this video to see more videos about ethnicity and race and how those aspects of identity are tied into other social systems and factors.